Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. On the front lines. Being on the front line comes with sacrifice, either emotionally or physically, or sometimes both. Today, our nurses and medical providers are on the front lines of this pandemic, reaching out every day to individuals who are ill and suffering. They struggle with their own stress and grief, and yet they continue for the greater good. Those of us who are able to stay home are grateful to those who keep our hospitals running, keep our grocery stores filled with food, and who deliver necessities to us. Those on the front lines are often the eyewitnesses, providing the firsthand accounts of what will be written in the history books. Dr. David Wilsey was on the front lines at the liberation of Dachau. On May 8, 1945, almost 75 years ago to the day, he wrote home to his wife, "Emily, we are sweating, stinking, existing in this hell on earth Dachau. Let every word of January or December Reader's Digest bore through the middle of your guts and multiply it 100-fold. Dearest, the atrocity reports are true and more. For over 8 days, I've seen, lived, smelled, existed it." At only 30 years old, Captain David Wilsey was one of 27 doctors who entered Dachau concentration camp during its liberation in late April 1945. He spent the next month giving medical care to former prisoners. Dr. Wilsey said very little about his experiences to his children, and in 2009, while cleaning out the family home, his children found a large box of letters. The letters he had written to his wife while in Germany about his time in the US Army, including the liberation of Dachau and experiences thereafter healing survivors. The collection of more than 280 letters are now part of the Holocaust Center for Humanities collection. In one letter, Dr. David Wilsey wrote to his wife, "Tell thousands so that millions will know what Dachau is." The Holocaust Center for Humanity is committed to preserving and sharing these stories so that we may learn from them. The eyewitness accounts portray the worst of humanity, but also the very best, and these become our guides and our role models. Dr. David Wilsey's letters are now all available on the Holocaust Center for Humanities website with educational lessons for students and teachers. I want to give a special thank you to Julia Thompson, our Education Outreach Coordinator, who worked for countless hours with a team from the University of Washington to put these letters online. Help us to continue preserving and sharing these important stories and lessons. Today and tomorrow, all donations will be matched through the Give Big campaign. You can make your gift easily on our website, holocaustcenterseattle.org. Just click the Give Big banner at the top of the homepage. We are grateful for donations of any amount. Thank you. It is my pleasure to have with us today Dr. Wilsey's daughter, Clarice Wilsey, who is joining us from her home in Oregon. Clarice was a university faculty member and administrator for 45 years before retiring to spend time sharing her father's message to never forget. Clarice is a member of the Holocaust Center Speakers Bureau and speaks to audiences around the Pacific Northwest. Clarice will answer questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions at any time. Thank you so much, Clarice, for sharing your family's story with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ilana. I really appreciate this opportunity. And first of all, I want to thank the Holocaust Center for Humanity because of their strong interest and commitment to my father's letters. And also, I'm awestruck at the dedication and commitment that all of you have had towards helping people to remember the Holocaust, to keep the memory alive, and to never forget so it never happens again. I also want to thank you for figuratively holding my hand through this whole journey the last few years. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. First of all, I want to remind you or let you know that last Wednesday, April 29th, was the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau. This Friday is the 75th anniversary of victory in Europe. So last week and this week are really two momentous days that really marked significant things in history. I want to First of all, honor the people who lost their lives in the Holocaust. I want to honor the people who survived the Holocaust, their children, and probably their grandchildren, and having lived through such a horrendous experience. I also want to honor the medical personnel, the nurses, the doctors, the lab techs, the medics, who were significant in helping to bring healing, not only to the survivors of Dachau, but also to the survivors of all the other camps that were liberated during this winter and spring. One of the things I'm going to do while we talk is I'm going to actually read certain excerpts from his letters. And the reason that I'm doing that is that I want to read it exactly the way he wrote it. I wish that you could see how he wrote it, because he uses asterisks and exclamation points and bolds and unbolds and stars. And I mean, it's very creative the way he writes. So I can only give you the words at this point. What I'm going to talk about today involves mystery, is surprise, atrocities, and hope. We have to have hope. We have to have hope that it never happens again. We have to have hope that it is never forgotten. So here is a letter that my father wrote to my mother, Emily, on June 1st, after he'd been at Dachau for over a month. Please, darling, don't feel you have to rant on paper about Dachau. I know you see it and know it for what it was, and that's all I care. All I ask is that you instill it into as many thousands others as you can, till maybe we can get millions to see it. My father, post-war, growing up, when we were growing up in Spokane, he couldn't talk about Dachau. He couldn't talk about World War II. He never marched in a parade. He never seemed to, as far as we knew, join in with any veterans in any Memorial Day parade or what have you. He just could not talk about it. And if we ever tried to bring it up, we either would get a, you don't need to know about this, or we get a disdainful look. My brother and sister and I grew up knowing that there was a trunk in the attic. We figured it had something to do with World War II, but we were never allowed to open the trunk, and it was never discussed. In fact, after our parents died, I at least wasn't even sure that the trunk was still there in the attic. We knew that our father had been in the front lines. We knew that he'd been in Dachau, and that was basically it. During the research of all of this information, I also discovered that he was in the Battle of the Bulge. Now, he never mentioned that, again, growing up, but I do have proof from looking at military documents and letters, etc., that he was also in the Battle of the Bulge, which was the bloodiest battle during World War II. So he went basically from the Battle of the Bulge to Dachau concentration camp. So there was never an openness to discuss any of this, not even with our mother. And I'm sort of thinking that they had this vow of secrecy. They didn't want their children to know the horror of what they'd experienced. And of course, back then, I didn't realize about all the letters. So my mother really had a front seat in terms of finding out about what my father's experience was. Next slide, please. So I don't know how many of you know, but Dachau was in Germany, southern Germany, 4,700 miles to Bismarck, North Dakota. Now, why Bismarck, North Dakota? Well, when my father left for war, my brother was born and he had a very serious heart condition at the time. And so they decided that my mother and my infant brother would go to Bismarck, North Dakota, live with her parents, and be there during the war. So that's why we have the arrow from Germany, Dachau to Bismarck, North Dakota. I do want you to know that even though my brother was very ill at the time, he's just fine right now. And that's really terrific. His letters would start out, next slide, please. Back again, please, I'm sorry. His letters would start out somewhere in Germany, somewhere else in Germany, somewhere else again in Germany. Now, why did he do that? Well, first of all, the vast majority of letters sent by servicemen to their families were redacted or censored. In reading all of the letters, almost 300 of the letters, I saw 2 letters that were censored or redacted. Now, I don't know if that was because he was an officer. I have no idea why that was. But these letters went from Dachau to Bismarck, North Dakota. And then when he returned, they went to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he was affiliated with the University of Minnesota Medical School and was teaching anesthesiology. And that's where I was born. And then they moved to Spokane, 2 houses in Spokane. And the amazing thing, in the second house in Spokane, there was a fire. The letters were not damaged. So to me, these letters have an incredible sustaining power. And I'm so glad that these letters were preserved through all those miles, through fire, to be able to be shared with people, to have another documentation of what happened at Dachau concentration camp, so that nobody could say it didn't happen, it's fake news, it didn't exist. Okay, now next page, please. So I want to tell you a little bit about my father. He was a very verbal man, extremely verbal. One of his colleagues told somebody that if you asked Dave Wilsey what time it was, he would tell you the history of the clock. So my dad was verbal. He loved words, but there were some words that he could not talk about. World War II, Dachau concentration camp. My father loved words, and on our coffee table was a large, unabridged dictionary. Now you can imagine a kid asking your parent, what does such and such word mean? Well, the response was, look it up. Didn't matter if I knew how to spell it or not. I tried to figure it out. Once in a while, he would give me or give us a slight clue about how to spell the word. Not only that, then we had to use the word in a sentence to be able to show him that we knew what it meant. So I knew he loved words. So when he would not talk about Dachau or the war, there was really a dissonance in terms of, on one hand, he talked a lot, on the other hand, he was very silent. Here is another letter that I want to read to you. Now, this letter is before Dachau. It's related to President Roosevelt's death. So to give you a little information, my mother was a physical therapist at Warm Springs Foundation, which was the polio rehabilitation institute that President Roosevelt developed because of his polio. Now, my mom wasn't actually his physical therapist, but she did have the opportunity to be there when he was there. She had the opportunity to drive his hand-controlled car into town. She was there when Roosevelt tested the walkie-talkie. And she was there when Pearl Harbor happened and President Roosevelt was there. And in one of her letters to her family, she said she felt so sorry for him because he looked so exhausted. So here is the letter from my father. April 16th, 1945, which was 4 days after President Roosevelt died. And he did die at Warm Springs, Georgia. I felt for you on Friday the 13th, 1945, when I learned of Roosevelt's dying. At the moment, we were certainly far from anyone on a high crest of half mountainous nature, sort of awesome nature. It's hard to describe my feelings, but the hugeness of world, death, geography, life all swooped up into one in an awesome, horrible, yet beautiful manner in one massive gulp at me. Many of his letters use those creative words, use those creative adjectives, alliterative words. He was just very creative in the words that he would describe. But as the letters get closer and closer to Dachau and then arrived at Dachau, his letters got darker and darker and darker. But for all the fascination he had with words, he just couldn't utter what had happened at Dachau and what he was experiencing. When there would be somebody on the news and they would say the Holocaust didn't exist, he would go ballistic. He would rail at the TV. He would yell. He would say, I was there. I know it happened. And then he would let off a string of expletives, which I will not mention on this program, about what he thought about the bestiality of the Nazis. Or we'd ask him a question and he'd say, you don't need to know this. And he'd give us a disdainful look. So next, please. This is a picture of my family. My father and me on the left. I'm about 3 years old there. And that's my mother, my sister Sharon, my brother Terry, my father, and then there I am at 6 years of age. So I want to tell you how my role got involved in this intertwining between my life and my father's experience with Dachau letters. I was 6 years old. We had moved from one house in Spokane to another, and there were all these boxes in the dining room. And I was trying to help. Well, I probably was told to help. So I'm opening up boxes and I find these pictures. And these pictures are pictures of dead bodies, skeletons, people in white coats, piles of bodies. Now, mind you, at 6 years old, I hadn't even experienced the death of a pet. So I didn't know what death looked like. I had no clue what they were. So innocently, I asked my father, what are these pictures? Well, I'm sure the fact that I saw these at 6 years of age reacted in him, and he said, little girls shouldn't see these. Well, he was right. Little girls shouldn't see these. He grabbed the pictures and they disappeared, and I never saw them for almost a century later. I sat on the dining room floor and I just kind of was shaky because I just really didn't understand and know what had happened. But throughout my life, periodically, I would remember those pictures, and I never forgot. Next slide, please. So you'll be glad to know we're going to skip forward to 2006, and we don't have to go through every year of my life. So in 2006, I was at a conference for the University of Oregon in Washington, D.C., and there was some time I had between the conference and visiting friends. So I thought, well, I'm going to go to the Smithsonian. Well, I'm on the train and I hear people talking about the Holocaust Museum, and I'm thinking, oh, yeah, my dad had something to do with that. And then I hear the conductor say, the next stop is the Holocaust Museum. So I thought, I think I'll go there. So I get off, and it had to have been spring break for a lot of students because there were a lot of middle school aged looking children. And they were all jumping around and laughing and joking and kind of, play hitting each other. And I just stood there. I had no idea what was going to happen or what would happen once I got in there. But eventually they let us in. And if I was in an audience right now, I'd have you raise your hand as to how many have been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. But since I can't see you, I'll just have to guess that some of you have been to this museum. But for those of you who have not, I will describe, there's 3 elevators. The first elevator on the right had probably 40, 50 people. Middle elevator, nobody. Left elevator, nobody. So I'm standing in the middle elevator because I wanted to be first in line. Now, if this next thing hadn't happened, this next amazing thing would not have happened. So the man at the front of the long line said to me, do you want to get in front of the line? And I said, well, yes. But in my mind, I'm thinking, had I asked him, he would have probably said, go to the back of the line. But nevertheless, he did let me in the front of the line. And so I'm just standing there. And the policy was you went to the 4th floor and then you worked your way down. So I want to read you a letter that relates to this experience that I found after I found the letters. And mind you, When I was at the museum, I had not discovered the letters. I knew nothing about the letters. So May 8th, 1945. Why? The horror is so unbelievable that they flew congressmen to see it the day we came. That famous Washington, D.C. woman correspondent, Life magazine, ate with us this noon to see it. Ambassador Caffrey from France saw it today. General Eisenhower is expected any minute. All Europe's cabinet ambassadors, newsreelers, etc., have been or are here to make seeing believing, and he writes that all in caps. And then he said, look for me in a newsreel. So we go up to the 4th floor and the door opens, I'm in front and there's like 40 some people behind me. I look across to the wall and there on the wall is a TV with a picture of my dad walking past 2 former prisoners. Well, my heart started pounding, my knees started shaking, I got weak. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And he was walking by 2 former prisoners dressed in those striped kind of pajama types that you may have seen in pictures. And I kept saying to myself, that's not my father. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. I just was dumbfounded. And I watched it about 15 times. And then I thought, well, I guess I better go because it was getting late. And so then I left. And then I thought, no, I better go back, watch it a few more times to make sure I know where he came in the picture. And plus, I wanted to see some of the rest of the museum. So the reality of seeing him saying in his letters, look for me in a newsreel, I saw the reality of that in this film. So I went down to the reception desk and I said, I'm 95% sure my dad is in a picture up there. Do you think somebody would like to know his name? And the man said, oh, yes, but the public relations people aren't available right now. So he said, give this woman a call tomorrow. So I went outside, I called my mom and I go, Mom, guess what? And I, rattled off what had happened and she didn't say anything. And I said, but Mom, did you hear me? And I said it again. Didn't say anything. I said, Mom. And she said, well, that's interesting. And that was the last thing I heard from her. And the next time I went to Spokane, I told anybody that was available, friends, neighbors, what have you. And if they would say to my mom, Emily, so what do you think about that? Or Emily, that's really amazing. She'd say, oh, that's interesting. From Washington, D.C., after I talked to my mom, I called my brother and my sister. And of course, they were ecstatic and it was just an amazing experience. So the next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. So I called the woman the next day and I said, I'm 95% sure it's my father, but I wasn't alive. And so I'm not sure if it was he, but I think it was he. And she said, it was really sweet what she said. I think you had such a visceral reaction. Your soul knew that it was your father. Okay, so in 2009, after our mother died in 2008, we were at the home in Spokane trying to clear out the house of 56 years. And you can imagine my brother and my sister and I lived in 3 different places and we were coming back regularly to clean out the house and figure out what to do with 56 years of things. And so I kept thinking about those pictures, but I never said anything to anybody, but it was always in the back of my mind. And I'd think, okay, now I'm going to find those pictures. Well, now I'm going to find those pictures. Never found the pictures. And I thought, well, okay, I guess my dad was too upset that I saw him and he probably threw them away. So another incident happened and I was in the living room. My brother and my sister were in the hallway and I think that I thought they were in the attic and they actually were in the attic. And again, it was like, did that trunk exist? But they found it. It was in the back of the attic, caked with dirt. My brother hauled it out and my sister came running out of the hallway going, oh no, I'm going to be sick. Oh no, I'm going to be sick. Well, I thought maybe something had happened to my brother. So I ran down the hall, and there, standing on the attic steps, was my brother holding this huge swastika. Well, we were all horrified. Why did our father have this horrific symbol? Well, I learned later from some people at another Holocaust museum that many of the soldiers would take things like the swastika home as a sign of victory over the Nazi regime. It wasn't to celebrate the Nazis. It was to celebrate the victory that they had been defeated. So we're in a hurry, and so boxes are being sent to cars, vans, what have you, randomly, no thought as to whom would get it. So this was July of 2009. And about 4 months later, I was thinking, it was a rainy day in Eugene. I was thinking, I wonder what's in these boxes. I opened up the box, and there were these letters. I did not know that they existed. They were in pristine chronological condition. These are a little messed up now because a variety of people had looked through them, and I just didn't think to take a picture at the beginning. But there in the middle of that box of letters, which I finally discovered was 280 to 300 letters, were those horrible pictures that I saw when I was a child. And I just started looking at those pictures. I started crying. I just was like flabbergasted as to being able to see these pictures. And then I knew that the liberation had happened the end of April. And so I went through the letters to the end of April, and this is the first letter that I read from my father in that box. We roared through the gates of Dachau, figuratively minutes after his liberation, while 40,000 wrecks of humanity milled, tore, looted, screamed, cried, as like depraved beasts, which the Nazi SS had made them. In those early minutes, I saw captured, SS tortured against a wall, and then shot in what you Americans would call cold blood. But Emily, God forgive me if I say I only saw it without a single emotion, and in big caps, because they so had it coming to them. After what I had just seen, and what every minute more I have seen of the SS beast action, I read several letters. I cried. I just was overwhelmed at looking at these pictures, at the letters. And to be honest with you, I just put it aside for a while. And of course, life happens. Another thing that was in the box, and part of why I'm showing this is on the left, there's this box, and I have no clue what that is. This is a box, my grandfather's handwriting, days from overseas, and you see this instrument. And the reason I show that is I think it was German because of some markings on it, but I'm hoping that someday somebody will be able to say, oh, that's a blah, blah, and they'll tell me what it is. So if you happen to know what that is, maybe you can let the Holocaust Museum know and they can let me know. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, no, back, left, previous. Thank you. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit of information about my father's assignment to the front. He was in the 116th Evacuation Hospital, which was in General Patton's 7th Army. I want to tell you a little bit about an evacuation hospital. First of all, a soldier was injured on the field. Litter bearer would go in a cot, kind of a canvas cot, carry them to the aid station. At the aid station, they would make sure their names, look at their tag tags. They might give them morphine if they were in a lot of pain. They might put a tourniquet on. And then depending on what the situation was, they would send them to a field hospital. And you probably heard about a field hospital that was built in Central Park during the in New York City during the COVID virus. So then some of the immediate things would be taken care of, maybe broken arms, what have you. But if they needed surgery, they then went to the evacuation hospital. all of these places were within what they call the combat zone. But the evacuation hospital was probably several miles behind the front lines, partly for protection, partly to make sure that they didn't get shot while they were trying to operate on the soldiers. My father was on the front lines from around September of 1944 to April of 45. He stayed in the Army to finish his assignment, and he finished February of 46 at Fort Knox in Louisville, Kentucky. On April 29th, as I've said, my father's battalion liberated Dachau. So you see the happiness. And when they arrived there, some of the prisoners were going, Americans, Americans, the Americans are here. They were so excited and they were so elated, as you can see. They were throwing their hats. The picture on the right, that was when the Americans raised the American flag and took down the Nazi of soldiers, survivors. I mean, it was just total jubilation. The next slide, please. My father would talk a lot about, in the letters, about the hugging and the kissing and the yelling and the excitement of all of the prisoners. They were just so elated. Now, I have to tell you kind of an interesting story about my father. He was a very hygienic man, and you want a hygienic man when you're doing a surgery, when you're having anesthesia, but he also carried that home. And I'm sure that you've seen TV shows, medical TV shows, where they're scrubbing for surgery, right? Okay, so my father continued that at home. So before dinner, he would stand at the sink and he would scrub for dinner. My brother and sister and I would kind of roll our eyes at each other, but we would wait until Dad got finished scrubbing his arms for dinner. So we knew that he was very hygienic all the way growing up. This picture is a map of Germany, and I didn't know where Dachau was at the time of all of this happening until I looked at a map. So it was in southern Germany, which is considered Bavaria. It's very close to Austria, and I actually have a picture of him and some colleagues standing at the border of Austria. Next, please. So let me tell you a little bit more about Dachau. The number of prisoners incarcerated in Dachau between 1933, it was the first camp, and 1945 exceeded 188,000. And they were mostly political prisoners. You may have heard of the name Heinrich Himmler. This was his quarters where he designed and was the architect of all the other despicable concentration camps. There were Jewish people there. There were political dissidents. There were intellectuals. There were gypsies. There were homosexuals. There was people from all countries were at Dachau, which I had no idea until I started researching all of this. The number of prisoners who died in the main camp between 1933 and 1944, I'm sorry, May of 1945, was at least 31,000, but it's not even clear how many because of the statistics. In some of the research that I've done through this whole thing, I learned that the Nazis, when they kind of had the clue that the Americans were coming, they took thousands of people from the Dachau concentration camp, took them into the woods, and shot them. So when the Americans got there, it didn't seem like as many people, but certainly 31,000, 40,000 was a whole lot of people. I would like to read again some of what Ilana wrote, but to finish the letter. Emily, we are sweating, stinking, existing in the hell on earth, Dachau. Let every word of January or December Reader's Digest bore through the middle of your guts and multiply 100-fold. And dearest, the atrocity reports are true and more. For over 8 days, I've lived, smelled, existed. It is one of 27 doctors to try to correct the medical horror component of the hell on earth. Bodies starved to 50 pounds, men piled like rotting cordwood, huge gas chambers built like shower rooms, as a ruse, hangman scaffolds, cremating ovens for dead, dying, or still conscious skin and bone, wrecks of humanity. Stopping high as you walk to work over dead bodies in the street, stormtroopers, the SS, riot prisoners, and man-eating Doberman pinschers, all rotting. I mean, when I read that, the image of it was just horrific, and it too kicked me in the gut, so to speak. Millions of words have been written about the Holocaust. I myself recently have read over 20 books related to the Holocaust and World War II. And they've been written by historians, military personnel, and survivors. And if you haven't read a book by a survivor, I would really encourage you to do so, because it will give you a real eye-opening picture, word picture, of what happened to these innocent people. You may have heard of the Diary of Anne Frank, which is very well known. You may have also heard of Night by Elie Wiesel. Those are two books that you could start with, and you could contact the museum or your library to find out other books that have been written by Holocaust survivors. Next picture, please. So I want to give you a little bit of an example of what the letters look like. Now, think about onion skin paper, really thin kind of paper, and that's what these letters were written on. Very delicate. And some of the letters had 6, 7 pages in the envelope. And he wrote and he wrote, and it's almost like, I don't know if he tended to do this, but it was like therapy. He just poured out his feelings, his expressions, his worry, his concerns. He would write off on his cot with a flashlight. They even had to do some surgeries with flashlights, if you can imagine. But his letters, he loved to say dastardly Dachau. And if you can imagine a capital D and a parenthesis, and then inside that parenthesis, he'd write, den dismal, dirty Dachau. So in 1945, thousands of prisoners from other camps were sent to Dachau. So some of the people who were marched from Auschwitz ended up in Dachau, but not as many as left because of the distance, the cold, the bare feet, the torture. When my father stopped at Dachau, initially for 8 days, he did not write a letter. Well, you can imagine my mother wondering where his letters were. Well, I'm going to tell you a little story. My father, I learned from the letters, had cut his finger, had some kind of a wound in his finger. Now today, what would we do with a cut? We would maybe ignore it. We'd put Neosporin on it. We'd put some bandages on it. We might wash it really good. And then we would just go on our business. Well, my father had a cut sore in his hand, no clue how it happened. And he was not able to write because he had to bandage it so carefully and so thoroughly that the typhus, typhoid, and tuberculosis couldn't seep into that cut. So he didn't write for 8 days, and I'm really sorry for that on a number of reasons, but mainly because it would have just been really powerful, I am sure, to have heard and read what he indicated in those 8 days. Now, I'm sure that some of that was in these future letters. So as you see at the bottom where the red circle is, that says dastardly Dachau. Okay, the next, please. Okay, this letter is another one, and at the top it says Dachau concentration camp, 15 May 45, and I'm like, oh my gosh. Every time I saw that at the top of a letter, it just, again, kind of kicked me in the gut. But because you can't read the writing, I'm going to read it to you. And all of his letters were sent in these types of envelopes. And every letter in that box had an envelope with airmail special delivery. So here is that letter that you can't read. I flood you with latrine rumors just because we get flooded with latrine rumors. I believe the rumor will materialize that they burned Dachau to the ground, all in black letters or bold letters. It's funny, but we all just sort of hopefully wait with fiendish glee for that moment to see this dastardly place just roaring in flames. Maybe we're sort of like Nero, huh? However, besides performing an ignominious and justified end, it would consume the typhus with it. To give you an idea, it would be like burning downtown Bismarck, where she was living, yet residential Bismarck, where the SS barracks officers were, would be left to live in for us, our patients, etc. So maybe the sword will be turned. There's an old quotation, and it says, "At Dachau, you enter by the door and leave by the chimney." This time and for all eternity, let us hope Dachau leaves by the chimney, instead of its hundreds of thousands of people. Hooray, it will be gone. And I'm sure that's true for all of the other camps, Auschwitz, etc. Okay, so if you're interested in seeing more of these letters, you can go to the Holocaust Museum the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle, and you can look at their website for the Wilsey collection, W-I-L-S-E-Y, and you'll be able to read the letters. And a wonderful group of graduate students at the University of Washington and Julia Thompson developed a program called Omeka, so you can look at them by date, you can also look at them by subject. And I'm very grateful to the graduate students at the University of Washington and Julia for doing that. Next, please. Okay, so here's a typical doctor picture, but this is inside an evacuation hospital. I'm not really sure if the two pictures on the left include my dad, only because they were his pictures, so he probably took the pictures. But it's also possible that if he is, he's in the bottom one with the man facing us. The picture on the right, these physicians were all quarantined, as you know about quarantining now, because of the outbreak of typhus, tuberculosis, and typhoid. And the doctors had to stay inside, they couldn't leave. Another reason the place was quarantined is you probably know that when people have starved, haven't had enough to drink, haven't had enough to eat, if they eat too much, drink too fast, it could kill them. So one of their jobs was to try and keep the prisoners in the camp, not to punish them, but to keep them alive. And so this is where my father's German language helped, because he was able to say to them, we're good doctors, we want to help you, we want you to be well. We are not the Nazi doctors who were terrible to you. So this is a fun story, if you can imagine a fun story at Dachau. My father's on the left, and then the woman who has her arms on the man in front of her, she's a nurse and he's a doctor, and the others are doctors and nurses. Well, she and that man decided to get married at Dachau, and my father walked her down the aisle at Dachau to get married. Can you imagine telling your children and your grandchildren that your wedding ceremony was at Dachau concentration camp? But you know, they were, I'm sure that they were just trying to find some kind of hope in the horror of what they were experiencing. Next, please. Okay, this is a picture of the typhus ward at Dachau. And this used to be the brothel. And when everybody left or was killed, they turned it into a typhus ward. Now, do you see that arrow, the red arrow? That is my father. And this picture I also found at a museum, and I'll tell you about that a little bit later. The other doctors, the reason I'm 99% sure it was my dad besides his build, is that the other doctors did not have a mask. And remember, I told you that my dad was very hygienic and very germophobic, we'll say. He would be wearing a mask, the other doctors would not be wearing a mask. So that's the typhus ward, and you can see the physicians, medical people are mainly to the left, and the patients go all the way back. Okay, here's another operating room picture with my father and his colleagues performing surgeries. And I remind you that sometimes they had to do these surgeries, many times they had to do these surgeries at night and in the dark and with flashlights. Can you imagine doing a surgery in the dark with flashlights? Glad it doesn't happen today. Next, please. So this is a picture of my brother, myself. I think I'm about 6 months old, and that's my father. We're in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I was born, and he was teaching at the University of Minnesota Medical School. And my father wrote in several letters that war was changing him. War changes things. You'll just have to see for yourself. But it was tragic. And to see the human cruelty, bigotry, hatred, torture, it had to have affected any human being, anybody who was in a war. So war changes things. You'll just have to see for yourself. And he locked all of his memorabilia in the trunk for 65 years until they were discovered by his children in the back of the attic in that trunk. It was amazing, absolutely amazing to find these letters. Next, please. So my father, I really believe, was a hero during World War II. In the Battle of the Bulge, as well as at Dachau, and probably wherever else he was that we may not know. My father was awarded the Bronze Star for service, which I believe is either the third or the fourth highest award that one can get in the military. So I want to tell you how that happened. My father and his colleagues did over 5,000 anesthesias in a period of just a few months in the Battle of the Bulge and just after that. So my father came up with a creative way, and this was documented in the award description that he had that I found hidden behind a piece of paper behind this Bronze Star. And it was for meritorious achievements. And my father, what he had done is he imagined a circle and then 7 operating tables in spokes going around that circle. And my father stood in that circle and went around and around and around 7 times, multiple times, monitoring the anesthesia. Now, can you imagine, if I'm having anesthesia, I want one anesthesiologist. I don't want 7 other people or 6 other people competing with me. But that's what he did. That's what was necessary to help people stay alive and to get that immediate surgery that had to happen. The middle is his a Red Cross armband. And this was worn by the military medical people. Now, according to the Geneva Convention, they should not be shot by the Nazis. But sometimes, even though they had the band, they were shot. But this was supposed to be protection. On the right, and this was another gut punch for me, was this pass that said Dachau concentration camp, and that this pass allowed Captain David Wilsey to move around Dachau concentration camp, and it was signed by the commander of the unit that he was with. Well, just to see that he was a member of the permanent staff just kind of threw me, but I understood after I thought about it a while, he had to have something so that people would know who he was. And also, I think what happened was the Nazis, I've read, I didn't hear this from my father, but no, I didn't hear this from my father, but some of the Nazi guards would try to dress up in American uniforms or medical coats or whatever. So, and try to pretend that they were Americans or they were American doctors. So I think that this is part of the reason why this happened. Next, please. My mother respected his memory and kept the trunk closed. And so that's why we never were able to look at it. After I found the letter, I saw my father at the Holocaust Museum. I asked my mom if we could look in the trunk, and she said, absolutely not. But after she died and when we were clearing out the house, we did look in it. My father never spoke in any detail about the war until he died in 1996 in an ice storm in Spokane, Washington. The only time my father really spoke about the war was when he watched Schindler's List, which was made by Steven Spielberg probably 25, 26 years ago. But still, he wouldn't really talk about it, but it seemed kind of like he was obsessed with it. And he watched the film and what have you. And then again, of course, we tried to ask him questions and he just, wouldn't answer. You don't need to know about this. The picture on the right, my father is the man on the left. And those are two of his buddies that he talked a lot about in the different letters. And unfortunately, they're not alive anymore, but it would have been really fun to have been able to meet them. But they were very fond of each other and had as good a time as you could have at times while they were in the war together. Next, please. So I've been asked two questions frequently. Have you gone to Dachau? Do you want to go to Dachau? Do you think you'll go to Dachau? Well, why haven't you gone to Dachau? Well, first of all, in my mind, I was thinking, could I emotionally handle this? Second of all, I was thinking dollar signs. Could I really afford to do this? Well, one day, two friends from my church happened to come up to me and say, we're going to Dachau. Would you like to go with us? Well, I kind of fell off the bench and not really. And I said, well, let me see if I can figure out the finances. So on October 11th, 2018, my friends Connie, Warren, and I walked into Dachau concentration camp. We had an appointment with Dr. Riedla, who was is the director of research and archivist. And these four pictures are really significant of what I saw at Dachau. The top is in Yiddish, then French, English, never again, German, and then Russian, never again. Below are the badges that the prisoners had to wear. You've probably heard that the Jewish people had to wear yellow badges. Well, those are examples of all the different badges that the people in the concentration camp had to wear. And basically, that's the most color in the whole camp. It was very gray, it was very bleak, cement, concrete, what have you. The next, you'll see flowers, and that's on the tomb of the unknown Holocaust victim or victims. And I don't know how frequently, but I know that probably every couple days they change the flowers to honor the people that were entombed in that tomb. The picture above, you can't really tell, but it's looking out of the exhibition hall, which is where the prisoners would come in. They would be stripped naked. They would be examined and decided where were they going to go and what was going to happen to them. And this was even in the cold middle of the winter. They would stand there naked, no shoes, no clothes, no nothing. But that sculpture is a sculpture, and you can't tell, but of emaciated bodies. And when I was standing near it, I couldn't get a really good picture, but I stood under that and I was just awestruck at the image of that sculpture. Dachau concentration camp is huge and very bleak and very dark, and the exhibition hall has horrific pictures of what one would see. And the picture of my dad with the mask and the arrow, that picture is also in the exhibition hall. So my trip to Dachau was very significant for me. It was very powerful. It helped me to understand my father differently. It helped me to understand his letters, I'd read the letters so many times, it gave me an opportunity to kind of imagine where he was. The second basic question that people keep asking me is, are you going to write a book? Have you written a book? Well, until about a month ago, the answer was no, I haven't written a book. But next slide, please. Bob Welch, who is a renowned columnist journalist in Eugene, Oregon, collaborated with me to write a book that we titled Letters from Dachau, A Father's Witness of War, A Daughter's Dream of Peace. And you'll notice that was one of the pictures you saw earlier of my father and me when I was 3 years old. It was a labor of love writing this book, but it was also very challenging. We did lots and lots of research. We had lots of interviews. And if you so choose to want to read more about my father's letters and his experience, you're welcome to go to Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Next, please. In my father's letters, he would say to my mom, "Tell thousands so that millions will know what Dachau is and never forget the name of Dachau." And as I read these letters over and over, and I pondered and I thought, and I just really, really pondered and thought, I thought, I feel called to be his voice. So there I am on the left with some of the letters and the Red Cross armband. There's my father in his captain's hat. And I just want you to know that I'm now on the Speakers Bureau for the Holocaust Center for Humanity. I'm on the Speakers Bureau for the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education in Portland, Oregon. I've done 45 talks in Washington and Oregon and Wisconsin and Minnesota. And I'm really hoping that when the crisis is over, I'll be able to return. I had to unfortunately cancel a number of talks because of the virus. But I want to end and say thank you very much for your interest. Thank you for helping to remind people never again and never forget. We have to make sure that we put an end to bigotry, hatred, and cruelty. Even today, we've had experiences with anti-Semitism just December and January of this year before the quarantine. Where in the sphere of your world can you make a difference? And how can you stop hatred, bigotry, and cruelty? Now, I want to read you this one letter, and the reason I want to read it is it's a little bit lighter, but it also gives you an example of my father and some of what he experienced. You know what today was the first time in 7 months that I had a decent temperature-controlled shower. Everything from helmets to pails to asinine plumbing fixtures have served. The purpose for 7 months. Today, I was indebted to SS Gestapo beast Heinrich Himmler in his apartment, even a registering thermometer at the mixing point at the 2 pipes. He was a horrible person. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clarice. Thank you, Clarice. That was just really wonderful to hear about your father's powerful story. We have several questions for you.
Great.
That I will read off from participants. Hold on here. The first one is, and this was actually asked by 2 people. Did your father suffer from PTSD after the war as a result of his experiences?
Well, as you probably know, PTSD was not a term that came until after Vietnam. But yes, I do believe that he did suffer a type of PTSD. In my research, I discovered a concept called moral injury, and moral injury has 2 parts to it. One is that you do something that's against your morals. Whether you're religious or not, our society says thou shalt not kill. So even though it's the enemy, you might kill. The other part of moral injury is where you observe something that's against your morals. So obviously, he saw horrible, horrible things that were against his morals. So yes, I do believe that he had a version of PTSD. Yes.
Thank you. Another question we received was, how do you think your father, a doctor, would react to the COVID-19 pandemic if he were alive today?
Well, because my father today would be 105, I don't think he would help, but if he was younger, he probably would go out and help, even though he was retired. I think that he would be very, for the people he knew, his friends, his family, he would be very instructing about washing hands and how to make sure that we stayed healthy. And I think it would really sadden him. And I also think that it probably would bring back some memories of the typhus, typhoid, tuberculosis, the virulent diseases then and now.
Thank you. And one last question, and I think you touched on this, but I think it's a good one to end on, which would be, if your father had some advice for us today, what do you think it would be?
I think it would be, that's a really, really good question. I think he would say, stop hatred, end bigotry, try to care about people. I think that this experience in war in Dachau just had an indelible mark on him, and it would make him sad to see some of the things that are happening today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Clarice, for sharing a story with us today and for being a part of our programming. It's
Thank you
really
so much.
impactful.
I appreciate it. And I just want to remind people the Wilsey collection is at the Holocaust Museum in Seattle.
Thank you.
Stay healthy and wash your hands.
Thank you, Clarice. And I want to also take a moment to thank our incredible team at the Holocaust Center for Humanity that has been working so hard. Of course, our incredible executive director, Dee Simon, who always challenges us to see the big picture, Nicole Bella, our director of development, and Richard Breen, our museum and technology director, pulling the strings behind these online programs. Lori Werschel-Cohen and Craig Verniest, who helped to prepare the speakers you have been hearing. Our education team, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, and Rosa Campos. Amanda Davis, our Senior Operations and Engagement Officer, and our development team, Sydney Draytel and Ellie Selesky. Katie Lawrence, of course, our administration coordinator, who keeps our office running smoothly. This team is moving forward at full speed to continue to offer programs and resources, preserve stories, and teach the lessons of the Holocaust. Please consider helping to support our work. Donations today will be matched through Give Big. Just click the Give Big banner on our homepage, holocaustcenterseattle.org. I hope you will join us next week for another special program, which will be offered in partnership with the Queen Anne Book Company. It's a conversation with Neil Bascom, who's the author of Hunting Eichmann and The Nazi Hunters. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much, and that concludes our program for today.